everyone, and welcome to Houseman's Books. My name is Juliet, Jacques, and tonight I am hosting a conversation with Joanna Walsh, one of my favourite writers and indeed illustrators on occasion, about her new book with Verso, Girl Online, a User Manual, which is here. You can't see the cover too well on my low-res webcam, but there it is. As I said, Joanna is an incredibly prolific writer, published numerous books, fiction, essays, non-fiction, about a range of subjects, including hotel living, breakup, and writing, and now about life on the internet. Being perceived as a girl, being perceived as a woman, and what that means and how to navigate it. We were going to do an event together on Twitter Spaces last month, which turned out to be like the crappiest piece of software I think I've come across, probably since the World Cup Carnival on the Commodore 64. It's really not very good. Don't use Twitter Spaces, it's terrible, especially if you're trying to access it through a laptop. But Jennifer Tide from Verso stood in for me there and did a really bang-up job, which I was able to listen to but not participate in. So that's where we are with this. Thank you for joining us again. And Joanna, thanks for joining us as well.
And thank you. Hi.
Yeah, pleasure to do this again. Have we actually done a public event? Yeah, we've done plenty of public events together before.
Your radio thing.
Yes,
but,
and a Read Women event, I think, in 2014,
yes,
and a few others. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting to think about. I mean, I've just slagged off Twitter, and rightly so, because it's awful. But I first encountered you on Twitter. I remember, I think you followed me, and I was really intrigued by your profile, the list of interests, and then just browsing through your tweets, your sort of, your list of literary interests in particular. And I just thought, yeah, I want to be friends with you.
It was the early days of Twitter, and there were so many people. There were so few corporations and so many interesting people that I would never have met otherwise. Definitely, yeah.
It's weird to think back to that now, isn't it? Given what a cesspit it feels like these days. But let's talk about this book anyway. So, Girl Online. So maybe we could just talk a bit at first about how the book came about, what inspired you to write about your experiences of the internet in this way.
Well, I think I've been writing about appearing online for a while. Breakup was about appearing online, but also appearance, just the act of appearing as a woman in all sorts of spaces that are in some way public and in private spaces as well, which are to do with not so much to do with appearance, with the act of appearance, but other acts. And so I see all my work as part of a sort of continuum about a lot of stuff about identity, a lot of stuff about gender, which develops in different ways throughout my work and is continuing to. So it's this one in particular, I did actually want to write about that, the way that the internet has developed and the way that it's allowed and constrained selves in different ways. As we were just saying, Twitter used to be a kind of more low-key place, less corporate, less aggressive, but perhaps in many ways less powerful. Perhaps in some ways the friendliness was very consensual. So a lot of kind of flashpoints that are quite productive didn't happen in the early days. But also, I came to writing through, I really wanted to, I'd got to a stage with onlineiness that I wanted to write about the different stages of being online and how they'd been involved in both my personal identity and my writing, because and my offline life, because they'd really taken a kind of huge part in all of those things. I did actually come to writing through blogging, which seems kind of hilarious now, very much inhabiting this kind of pre-made slot in which in the 2000s you could place yourself if you wanted to identify as a female persona in any way. There are a range of them, but there's the kind of the core, at the core was this idea of of self-revelation, but at the same time, the selves that you were allowed to reveal were in some ways very kind of dictated by templates. So there was a kind of push-pull of freedom and constraint, which interested me very much. I'm very interested in people who are working at that time on blogs, some of whom I do know have gone on to become very interesting writers, and who started developing their identity as writers there. And yeah, so I kind of very much wanted to write about that moment. It seemed no one was talking about how important that moment was, how liberating, as well as how kind of constraining. A lot of people talk about the first person industrial complex, which is an excellent essay published in 2015 on Slate, written by Laura Bennett, which talks about the exploitative nature of confessional publishing in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But that kind of exploitation was to some extent mutual. The exposure, although I think the one of the editors that Bennett quotes, talking to someone who'd written a revelatory piece, which it was about incest, said, "Do you want to be identified with this for the rest of your life? Do you want this to be your online footprint?" And indeed, that is the case. But the writer went ahead and did it, and so it's very interesting to think about the complex number of reasons that are behind that, and that were behind the kind of hiding and the kind of revelation I did through online personas.
Yeah, that's all really interesting, and it touches on a lot of things that I'm really fascinated by. Not least because I was personally part of this. This online boom of sort of first-person, reasonably high-profile writing in the early 2010s, and became very interested in the psychological implications of kind of exposing and possibly exploiting yourself in this way.
Yes. Did you count your Guardian column as mostly being successful online, mostly being kind of getting through to people online?
Absolutely, and it was designed to do that. It sort of came out of the fact that I'd worked a lot of boring office jobs, and had constantly seen people looking at the Guardian when they were supposed to be working, like myself very much included, and thought, that would actually be a good platform to reach people to read about this subject in a way that they might not have done. And Twitter did a similar thing, really, introducing me to all sorts of perspectives.
It is also that kind of reaching out to audiences and engaging with audiences who might be very different audiences who to those who'd be looking for something like literary fiction or literary nonfiction.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that interests me about Girl Online is, we've already started talking about the specific writing conditions of the 2010s, and I want to spend most of the discussion on that because I think that's really interesting. But it does raise the question then of why is Girl Online sort of intertwined with epigraphs from Alice in Wonderland? What made you choose that?
Well, I just came up with the idea. In the first place, the book was kind of going to be a user manual for Elysian subjects. Now it's just a user manual because Alice didn't come in quite as much as I thought she would. But on the other hand, I think she does in some ways represent, she acts as a kind of nexus for a lot of cultural ideas around the idea of girlhood, both as an innocent state of youth, a commercial exploitative state, if you look at all the kind of Alice merchandise you see, especially kind of British nostalgia heritage merchandise, but also the kind of I mentioned towards the end of the book a selfie that I found of Paris Hilton in a sexy Alice Halloween costume. Holding a tray of drinks, the sexy costume sort of resembled almost a kind of, a waitress's outfit as well, with a kind of little apron instead of the smock. So this idea of kind of serving, of self-serving, of self-exploitation, of sexual exploitation, of sexual self-expression, all these things were coming together. But also, Alice, I was thinking very much of some thought experiments to do with artificial intelligence, which I thought might be just as well applied to what humans do to themselves online via these personas. So I was thinking of her in conjunction with Alan Turing's Child Machine from his 1950 paper, Computers, Machinery and Intelligence, where he talks about the idea of AI and whether it is possible for machines to learn, even hypothetically, theoretically at that time, whether they can be taught. And if so, how should they be taught? Can they be taught as a child is taught? And if so, what kind of authority does he says that they can be taught through reward and punishment like a person, but to assume authority over machines just as to assume authority over a human child is to take a certain position, and it's that it might be quite difficult to justify.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, and it gives us a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of the 20th century, I think. So let's bring the conversation back to something close to the present. I think this might be a good place to have a reading on the book to set up some themes for the rest of the conversation. So maybe you'd like to talk us through the extract that you're going to read and then share it with us.
Great, I will. This is from the beginning of the second half of the book. The book's divided into two parts. One is a woman sitting in front of a machine, so a woman who's very much occupied with the constraints of her offline roles, which are very much to do with where she is, what she's meant to be doing, and her relations to other people in her life. Whereas the screen seems to offer an escape from those, although it's a kind of heavily conditional escape. So just right at the beginning of the essay Girl Online, which occupies the second half of the book, I start talking about this exact moment we're talking about the early 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s, and the kind of nexus of work being done then around female identity, sliding between various media, between print media, television and online, and how those conceptions of identity seem to feed into each other and seem to offer some opportunities, but as I said, also some constraints. So I'm talking about a range of kind of cultural products from that era. And so this is the beginning of Girl Online. Hello World. Hello World is the first executable run prompt for any programming language. Blinking into existence. Is it a newborn or an alien? It looks out at you from the screen. It, not you, says, "Hi. What purpose did I serve in your life?" In 2013, Mary Calloway, a girl who never grew up, published her only book, a quasi-fictional study of her online selves, whose title flips her first-person narrator into the object role. Using communication technology, one is threatened, quotes, with the possibility of becoming no more than a thing in the world of the other. Avatar Rennell, quotes R.D. Lang. "Hello," says Mary Calloway in the first line of her book's best-known story, Adrian Brody. The lightly fictionalized editor who slept with her cheating on his girlfriend is said to be someone I've worked for. A friend who also worked for him told me everyone knew. At the time Mary Calloway wrote Adrian Brody, I was no one. At the time, my friend, then an aspiring author and grad student in New York, was almost someone in that world. At the time, she was watching box sets of an early 2000s TV show called Sex and the City, about an aspiring author who made a living writing about her sexual experiences. In Sex and the City, my friend saw a model to orient herself towards, an on-screen example with enough to identify with, enough to envy, to produce a moment of desire. At the time, I, a provincial mother in another country that was not New York, was watching Sex and the City because it showed me something I could not aspire to. For my friend, it seemed almost real. For me, it was fiction. But we both identified with what we saw on screen. Why? The writer and critic Emily Gould called Calloway's story Adrian Brody a post before it became fiction. She meant a blog post, this was 2011, on a blog, short for weblog. Social forums came first, but blogs took a step back from a rent public space and were the first entirely personal, self-administered sites. Text-based, as the capacity to produce images remained at first limited, and imitating the one-way street of older media, blogs were often, or were assumed to be, diaries, written under the sign of what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick called nonce taxonomy, of gossip, the form used by, quotes, effeminate and gay men with all women, to have to do not so much with the transmission of necessary news as with the refinement of necessary skills for making, testing, and using unrationalized and provisional hypotheses about what kind of people there are to be found in one's world. Emily Gould was famous at the time for the diary-style critical columns she published in her eponymous blog, Emily Magazine. Emily Gould is Emily Gould's in real life name. Murray Calloway is not Murray Calloway's IRL name. Her offline name remains a mystery. Carrie Bradshaw, a writer of self-revelatory columns at a pre-blog New York newspaper, may be no one's name in real life, but is the fictional heroine of Sex and the City, a US, quotes, comedy drama, IMDb, screened between 1998 and 2004, based on a novel written by Candace Bushnell, starring 4 women and, quotes, created by a, quotes, openly gay Wikipedia man, Darren Star, whose sexual identity, according to Sedgwick, may signal familiarity with a shared taxonomy. In the show, Carrie appears on screen, writing on screen, and we see her often late at night gaze at her words as they appear one by one, glowing on the screen in front of her. A decade after Carrie's fictional diaries, Calloway's blend of the real and invented was greeted critically with fascinated disgust. Both works were written during a key moment in self-writing, as the TV's small screen shrank into the even smaller screen of the laptop. Nearly a decade after the publication of Calloway's book, this interplay of storytelling and true personal reflection is taken entirely for granted. Reflection is the ability of a program to read and modify its own structure and behavior as it runs. In this sort of sense, wrote Alan Turing, a machine can undoubtedly be its own subject matter. Both Calloway and Carrie's words cross between old and new media. In Sex and the City, Carrie is shown writing on a laptop for print publication. Calloway writes about and in the language of the internet and is published both online and in print. Both works are set in the imaginary city of New York, which I believe I have visited several times. In the opening credits of the TV show Sex and the City, the heroine Carrie Bradshaw is in New York City. We first see Carrie's face looking from side to side, like Ray Armantrout in her poem The Pretext, performing her own trans fiction as she watches Marilyn Monroe pretend to be transfixed, then cut to the sharp reflective New York City skyscrapers. Then Carrie is walking down a street, and then we switch to a perspective from a moving vehicle crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. A tire splashes, cut, the water hits Carrie and the action, which has until now been continuously mobile, halts, then cut to a bus driving past with an ad for her own newspaper column, Carrie Bradshaw knows good sex. But she does not at first know herself. Is this a moment of misrecognition in which Carrie confuses her own objectified image with her objective? Over the bus ad's assertion of her authorship, the screen floats the words, created by Darren Star. The creator's name is also the name of the fictional paper, The New York Star, that publishes Carrie's words. Can we prove any truths about our own structure? Any diary is Gesamtkunstwerk, a work of art that talks about itself, just as any autological word describes itself. A sentence that does this is an autogram, like, this sentence has got 44 characters. As in programming, what isn't there? The gaps are also characters. Carrie shares more than transfiction with Marilyn Monroe. She appears via the girl tropes of the rom-com heroine, beauty sprite threatened by their own exorbitance, sometimes mental, said Sedgwick on Monroe. People can't resist the incandescence of her being so unstable, sometimes physical, like Jell-O on springs. Jack Lemmon marvels at Monroe's ass bouncing above her high heels in Some Like It Hot. As does Calloway. In the beginning of Adrian Brody, Marie trips in heels at the moment she meets her internet crush, Adrian, who she's only previously met on digital platforms, pointing up her unsteady subject position, a rom-com staple. In an unscreened take for the Sex and City credits, Carrie is destabilized not by her image, but her shoes. There were 2 wardrobes. One was the tutu, and we did one pass where Sarah Jessica was wearing a blue dress and didn't get splashed. Instead, she trips when she sees the ad. That's Darren Starr again. In an alternate version, Carrie is not sullied by her own image as a professional dirtcher, but saved by it. In the smart blue dress, not the kooky pink tutu, she looks less vulnerable. She trips, then noticing her photo, recovers and walks away smiling at her success, at the irony of her situation in which she is creator, star, and audience. Carrie runs. Carrie pauses. Does she halt? Reflection in computing is a halting problem. It is about knowing when to stop in order to go on, while true continue does not halt, but runs forever in an infinite loop. On the other hand, the program, print, hello world, does halt. In romantic comedy, beginnings are important because all the endings are the same, but each Sex and the City episode ends with a question. Vulture.com states that Carrie asks 92 questions throughout the series, although there are 94 episodes. It is the question that halts the action. Halting is a matter of autonomy. A Turing complete machine can perform any possible computation. A universal Turing machine can emulate any machine that speaks its language. It is Turing complete. But a universal Turing machine that halts cannot decide for sure whether the Turing complete machine it runs will halt or will run forever. So emulation is incomplete. The halting problem remains, quotes, undecidable. Calloway's questions are what the poet and critic Denise Riley calls catastrophic. Do you think I'm pretty? Do you love me? Calloway's critique embedded in a deadpan representation of her avatar questioning an opaque online partner. But Carrie's questions are not Calloway's. They are addressed to no one, or to the viewer, or to the screen, or to herself. Carrie wonders and can't help but wonder. She represents a juxtaposition as ironic as that of being splashed by a bus bearing a perfect image of herself, and responds with a question that reflects on its own process. She is pretending to pretend to be transfixed. Remember, the Turing machine, like Carrie's question, is a thought experiment. What does a rhetorical question screen when it is screened? I can't help but wonder. Does this wondering queer the question form, which might be unacceptable if posed so directly as to bring things to a halt? Or does it keep the question looping in abeyance? That's the first section of Girl Online.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, God, there's so much to get our teeth into there. I think it might be nice to focus a bit more on Marie Calloway, though. I mean, how would you sort of have described your relationship with Marie Calloway's writing at the time? You know, what sort of thoughts and feelings did it provoke? And maybe what happened with Calloway for people who maybe not familiar.
Yes, I mean, who knows? She published one volume of stories in the States. We don't actually have a copy of here. Let me go and wave it at people because it's quite interesting to look at. So it has a big picture of someone on the front, which is presumably her. As I said, the name is, you know, we don't really have much information about her identity or offline life. It is a picture of the way that she describes herself in the stories. The inside, many of the stories are written in literally a direct message form, which is kind of quite interesting for the time. Some of them were published online at Moo Moo House before they were published in book form. I don't know whether this is what Emily Gould means when she says published as a blog post, because it seems on Moo Moo House they were certainly published as fiction. So I think, along with one of the other writers that I discussed at the time, Mary Calloway was very much a kind of literary writer, being published in alt-lit venues. The other writer that I talk about a lot is Catherine Sanderson, a British writer who became well known for a much more genre novel called Petite Anglaise, about her life in France, which was very closely based on her blog, which became hugely popular. And I think I don't know her at all, probably very surprisingly to her. And after writing 2 books, she went back to her pre-blog life, but the publishing them as books kind of destroyed her desire to blog anymore. So there's something that happens when you switch your life into fiction and that fiction becomes very closely identified with your life, that I think she was an early experiment in. I don't say that necessarily she was experimenting that herself. I think the experiment was kind of performed on her, which is interesting. But I think that at the time, because this was the late 2000s, there were all sorts of unpredictable consequences in sort of that in that exposure or self.
Yeah, and that's all really interesting. But in some ways, it's like a tale as old as time.
It is.
I mean, I wrote a lot on an English sort of straight white male author called Rainer Heppenstall, who was around in the mid 20th century, and he talks about redrafting and republishing one of his books. And in the introduction, he talks about changing the name of the protagonist to try and have the protagonist be identified with him a bit less, because people had sort of made negative assumptions about him based on the character in the novel, but also on his extensive memoir publishing, I think. So I wonder, kind of what is the difference between that and, you know, the place of a woman writing online in the early 21st century, and maybe what you think has changed.
There's something about being online. I mean, we say being because it's a continuous state. You know, writing a book about yourself or writing a book that's very, very closely based on your life, as Chris Kraus says, the thinly veiled story of me, when she talks about Women Like Clay in the more traditional sense. There's something ongoing about the online self-fictionalization, which can be very much identified with the version of yourself which you've chosen to also write online. It's interesting thinking of someone like Sanderson writing a version of herself online, which she didn't expect to find print publication or and in a kind of encapsulated form that meant that people were free to critique her as though she were a fictional creation, and yet she expected to continue as an online self via her avatar in the blog, which is something we're much more aware of now. We know that, you know, if we write something confessional, even on a different platform, or publish certain photos on Instagram, whatever, and then we continue to have an existence on any of those platforms, then that is going to be something that doesn't go away. That can be endlessly brought back, looped back to your existence.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about these kind of case studies.
Sorry, it didn't happen.
It's interesting to think about these case studies, isn't it, in the first sort of 2 decades of the 21st century, because in that time we've gone from the internet being something that was like an adjunct to our lives, really. You know, you might go on the computer once a day to check your emails. Occasionally you might think, I want to, you know, order a book from somewhere, or, you know, download a song or something. And, you know, certainly by the early 2010s, it's just where we all live. And there's something about that transition that I think is really interesting, and I think caught a lot of people out.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, I you know, with the kind of Elon Musk and Twitter rumors, I believe there's been talk of a revival of Myspace, and it's certainly become a kind of nostalgia thing. I was at a really lovely conference last week on digital art in Ireland, and there was someone who'd created a sort of nostalgia site, and there's a kind of huge appeal at the moment for sort of, I mean, I know this isn't new, but nostalgia for the internet itself, and for internet processes and ways of internet existence, often for gentler ways of existence. But they come along with they're usually signaled by aesthetics, you know, by 2000s aesthetics, or even 90s aesthetics, when you're making a site. Yeah,
no, that's really interesting. And yeah, as we sort of shift into this idea of the metaverse and away from this Web 2.0 idea, I think there is increasing nostalgia for the sort of Web 1.0, where people were, I think, a lot more anonymous, and there was a lot more space for this kind of experimentation. I mean, I was always very interested in early trans adopters of the internet, like Kate Bornstein, Sandy Stone, who documented their experiences online of like presenting as a woman, and the sort of responses they got from people in chat rooms, to how they presented themselves online, tried to read their genders. And you know, that was sort of space for experiments, and certainly for the trans community, and indeed for me, capturing the end of the sort of Web 1.0 culture, there was something quite interesting about the way you could sort of be part of a community whilst retaining your anonymity. And that was very liberating for
I was certainly anonymous on Twitter for the first few years, and was very much living a life where, you know, as I talk about in Girl Online, which enabled me to inhabit a very different persona to that which was expected of me offline. At the time, I had young children, and I was in a pretty unhappy marriage, and being online gave me an opportunity to talk with people who gave me a different range of interactions and a different sort of way of being, really. So for me, it was a very, very positive experience.
Yeah, and for me in lots of ways as well. And I mean, I could complain about Twitter all day, but you know, the communities and the culture and the kind of worlds it's given me access to, you know, things that would have taken me years, if not decades, to discover previously. That is pretty extraordinary. I mean, you have published a lot of fiction online yourself, and so have I. And you know, one thing I always find is that publishing fiction online, you know, for me, it doesn't really tend to seem like it's finding much of an audience. And I always have a problem with one of my problems with writing online and in the age of social media is having my audience measured to the last digit, not just in general in my Twitter following, but for each piece. And I, you know, sometimes find it's quite a work to resist wanting to just kind of give the people what they want in some way, and trying to stay true to myself as a writer. And not just kind of yield to what
at the moment of writing.
Yeah, not just yield to what gets the numbers, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's that notion of giving, which is very much to do with online. That, you know, one of the big problems about authorship online, and I know because I've been an editor online, I've worked for mags that pay and other mags that don't pay, and I've edited fiction and creative nonfiction. The circumstances under which an author gets paid, which is very important. Obviously, thinking about value, content, and the ability to sustain artistic careers. That's something I've been thinking a lot about in kind of less kind of booky projects, but projects that still involve text. Like I recently did a project for a US experimental publisher called Inside the Castle, where I created an AI version of myself through coding an AI and feeding it all my writing, including my private diaries, and just setting it off to write a book for me. So it did, and you know, I've read bits of it. I believe it's all right. But just, you know, that was really thinking about, you know, okay, you know, what are we being paid per word? Who's going to read it? Is anyone going to notice it? Should they? You know, these are questions that have come up before in writing, but you know, are particularly sharpened by internet existence. So it's I think it's very interesting to think about. Certainly, I know writing communities that have developed around online publications, which is wonderful, and most print journals do have an online aspect, which, as you said, of your Guardian columns, often that's where they're getting the audience. So it's worth thinking about, you know, as an editor and as a writer, being multivalent. But again, you're quite right in thinking that what you write is to some extent dictated by, well, the medium is the message. You know, the medium becomes part of what you're trying to write. And certainly if you're doing any creative projects on something like Twitter or Instagram, the amount that you can of writing you can put up there and the kind of format that are things you've been given.
Well, that's it. And I think there's so much paratext for writers now if you want to play that game. And, you know, I think for kind of older and more established writers, it's fine for them to just kind of eschew this mode of interacting with audiences. But, you know, I don't think we're going to get another J.D. Salinger or Thomas Pynchon coming through, because I think it's very, very, very hard now, and especially for like women and minorities of other, you know, genders and races, etc., it's very, very hard to just kind of refuse to be part of this sort of paratextual world around writing that comes out through the internet and say, look, I want to be judged my writing alone. Is that even possible now?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons my writing has become about this. It just seemed to be the issue for me. Self-presentation online and offline. In fact, to have a performative self, a more performative self online, was a way out of having a kind of a self which was kind of damagingly inchoate and exploitable offline. So that really meant engaging with with these kind of stereotypes of femininity, but also I do think that now people have got, something has changed. I was just reading today, Mackenzie Watt recommended me an essay by Anne Clark called The Girl, A Rhetoric of Desire, which I think was originally written in 1987. And this was because we'd been talking about Dickens' Notes Towards a Theory of the Young Girl, which is a kind of maddening book, if you've ever gone near it, because it's about the idea of the girl as a pure representative of capitalism, but not one that can in any way be inhabited in an interesting way by the people who are involved in producing that persona. Whereas the thing about online iterations of that persona is at least the girls in question, who may be of any gender, age, race, and have some kind of say in how that persona is produced, even if they feel under very, very, very great constraint or pressure to appear in certain ways. They are also, because they're the kind of script writer, the art director, the publicist, the director, the photographer, in whatever medium they choose to produce this persona, then usually something kind of happens. There's some sort of friction, because it's always because of amateurism. And I love amateurism. I'm really interested in it. I'm really interested in what happens, particularly when amateurs take a form which has hitherto been professional, the fashion shoot, the cookery demonstration. You get all these things in blogs, in vlogs, in TikTok, all sorts of and kind of put their real body there in real time and space, and I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot more we could say there as well. Yeah, there's lots of ways I'd like to take the conversation. Really, I mean, one sort of person who I developed a bit of a fascination with, coming to Twitter and thinking about the relationship between sort of femininity, confessionalism, journalism, social media technology, and sort of audience demands, was the Daily Mail columnist Liz Jones. I mean, I haven't really heard about Liz Jones for about a decade. I don't really know what she's doing now, whether she's still at it. But Liz Jones was a sort of very confessional columnist for the Mail, and a big part of her selling point was, how unreasonable she often behaved, and how miserable the whole endeavour seemed to make her. And there's one interview with her where she talks about, no one in her local town will talk to her because of what she's written about them in the town. It's obviously had an adverse effect on all of her personal relationships in its broad sense of, friends, families, lovers. And, has brought her kind of, voluminous hate mail online and so forth. But she went viral a couple of times. I think one was a piece where she was wanting to do some charity work in Somalia, and had never used the NHS before, really, because of her background and her political leanings, and then goes to an NHS clinic and says, I'm going to Somalia tomorrow, can I have all my jabs? And they just said, no, that's not how this works. And then there was another one, I think the following year, where she talks about how she wanted a baby and her partner didn't. So after they had sex, she fishes out a condom from the toilet or whatever, and tries to get herself pregnant with the contents of it. And she just wrote about this, and of course, my social media just erupted. And And I found Liz Jones interesting in a way that, other sort of contrarian writers I find incredibly boring, because it was sort of so strange, and the very obvious sort of self-loathing that often came through, and the self-harming of it, really, I found interesting. I actually tried to interview her for a New Statesman, and she demanded a fee for the interview, so that didn't happen. But I would have loved to have met her, really. And at the time, it really chimed with me in this sort of sense that I, because from writing about my own life online, my life as a trans woman, and this sort of anxiety about what happens if you, in order to up the stakes every time, like Liz Jones had to, you start contriving experiences to write about them. Like, how does that warp you psychologically? And is there a way out of that trap once you're in it?
Yes, it's kind of extraordinary. I can remember various, I didn't take as much notice of her as you did, but I can remember various kind of things just suddenly becoming a huge topic. It's interesting when you stage yourself as a subject for discussion. That's I think to some extent this was a situation that Catherine Sanderson found herself in, which I've written about in the book, though with far less power and far less experience and far less control over continuing on not continuing in that way. It's the kind of performativity of that sort of self. It makes me think about, I don't want to bring this up because I know that it's going to, of the kind of current British government and the sort of performative personas, which politics has become. Now, we won't talk anymore about that because it's just depressing. But it's the pressure to kind of to live an extremely performative life. As I said, performativity, I think, can be, it can be an alternative to, it can be a way out of your of a life in which you are constrained by the idea that you don't appear. But I have been, I went back and was reading Jack Halberson's Female Masculinities recently, and I was just very interested in his idea of masculinity as non-performance. And I thought, okay, how do you perform that then? How do you perform? I don't actually think masculinity is non-performative, but I was super interested in that he was writing about drag kings, and was just interested in, and I saw some great drag kings recently in Paris, just last autumn when I was on a residency there. But I was just thinking that's kind of super performative, and they were pinpointing a lot of things about masculinity that were performative. That kind of the performative persona, which is so often a gender performative persona, and of course in Liz Jones's it all hinged on kind of, it seemed a lot of it did hinge on kind of performances of gender, is very double-edged but endlessly fascinating.
And at this point, I think it might be nice to flex back to another writer you've already mentioned, who's Chris Kraus. And the way that I Love Dick, which was originally published in 1997, had this real renaissance in the early 2010s. And, I believe was a writer that you and I were both interested in and talked about. So I wondered if you sort of had any thoughts on why Chris Kraus, that novel in particular, had a renaissance in the internet era, and what we might take from that.
I think the epistolary nature of Chris's correspondence with Dick was something that that was particularly resonant, I think, in the era of emails and were direct messages happening. Skype was maybe some in Twitter DMs probably as well. I can't remember. So there's that kind of, the idea of that sort of intense erotic relationship conducted through words, which is something that I very much came back to in Breakup. I wanted to write about that disembodied yet bodily experience of obsessive erotics, which don't necessarily enact through the body. That is interestingly, I guess there's not so much in that book about Chris performing herself as there are in some of the other books. I suppose that's possibly because it's. I know that when I interviewed her when she came over around, I don't know when was it, about 2013, 14, something like that, and And I know that she said that torpor was far more personal, because, and that's why it was a kind of, I had a more of a fictional veneer to it. So it's interesting that, yeah, the kind of the confession, the word-based things, the yeah, you know, perhaps even the idea of adultery or is something that's had a particular it's had its particular kind of way of expressing itself online, or certainly via digital communication.
Okay, well, maybe that's a nice place to open up to some audience questions potentially. If people have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I don't think we've got any yet, but if you want to start thinking about anything you might like to ask. In the absence of that, while we're sort of waiting for questions to come in, maybe we could talk a bit more about blogging. I mean, you talked a bit about Petit Anglaise earlier, but you also mentioned like Eve Kosofsky, Sedgwick, and this idea of blogs as kind of diaries. And I think this sort of, what the blogs created was this sort of nether space between work that was intended to be purely private and work that was intended to be public. And I think there was a lot of deliberate blurring of those categories. And I wondered what you think of that and how generative you sort of found it.
Well, I think you know, it's very interesting because, of course, a diary is meant to be private, but the only diaries we know are public diaries, often written by people who at least had an inkling by the end of their lives that their diaries were going to be published. And also other people who didn't think they were going to be published, but were often writing professionally, so were kind of writing performatively to some extent. Yeah, so I think also Bridget Jones's diary was just a huge influence on the early years of blogging. Bridget Jones's diary being a fictional diary written in the 1990s, it very much like Sex and the City, very kind of like humorous take on a very similar sort of well, you know, perhaps not quite so glamorous, but as New York, but you know, a young woman's sort of erotic and romantic misadventures in the city, with a lot of comedy. So there was that kind of, that being purely fictional, as Sex and the City was purely fictional and very, very highly constructed. When I go back and watch the old Sex and the City on YouTube, I think how the writing is just extraordinarily spare and sharp. And there's, you know, it's I talk about amateurism, but this writing is extraordinarily professional. You know, it really harks back to things like screwball comedy. It's very much in that tradition. It's deliberately out there in being artificial. Everybody is they're talking like they would be on a Broadway stage. So these kind of influences on the diary, I think, were not necessarily real life diaries that people were looking at. I think they were looking at fictional diaries, diaries that had been entirely constructed as works of entertainment. So, you know, bringing yourself into that area, and particularly the self as an amateur writer, which is what blogs opened up. You know, they opened up to writers who had not and often could not be professionally published. I was not. I had no idea how to be professionally published. I started. I wasn't even thinking of it. In fact, I think around the Petit Anglaise era, I was actually just, an agent wrote to me and said, would you like to turn your blog into a book? And I was like, I thought of that. You know, I was an illustrator. I ran an illustration business, and my blog was largely observational illustrations, but with increasingly large amounts of writing on it. So I was really surprised to be, and I said, what, a book of drawings? And they said, no, a written book. And I had no idea of being a writer. And then actually I did go somewhere down this route, and they were clearly kind of thinking of me like Petit Anglaise as someone who might make a good genre writer. I did try very hard to write genre, and I was terrible at it. And then I realized it was because I didn't really read genre novels. So, you know, it just wasn't going to work for me.
I mean, I think the first thing of yours I really remember reading, and I definitely had it as a sort of chapbook, I think published by 3am. And I can't remember if I read it online or not. It was a short story of yours called Help Bahnhof, about a woman who's like waiting for a lover and like living in a train station. And I remember I really loved the story, and I found it very kind of raw, and the emotion in it, you know, very, very engaging and you know, empathetic. But you know, these are sort of talking about these books. These are the sort of qualities that an editor would demand of a confessional writer as well, I think. But there was something about the way you transposed that into fiction that I really, really liked. Yeah, and I wonder what sort of, you know, more.
I was very concerned with kind of voice and style, I think, and style not for style's sake. Though obviously I wanted to create something that had a veneer that was suitable, because the kind of the naturalistic voice of, for example, the diary, as I've just said, was really highly influenced by fictional works. So Hope Bahnhof also was influenced by what I was reading at the time. You know, I just discovered people like Jacques, Lispector, and I was thinking very much through that nouveau roman kind of mid to late 20th century way of approaching things, which, you know, it's something that hasn't left me, but certainly is something that it was part of what I was engaged with at the time very closely. And I was writing, I started writing because I didn't find my experience being told to me through conventional literary fiction. And I was searching for, you know, voices of my own. But of course, I don't think there's ever a voice which is uninfluenced your own. I mean, that's the nature of language. So I think that the fiction there is a desire to be in a certain place. It's a desire to carry what might be consigned to genre fiction into a space of literary fiction. So that, I will say, disingenuously is there. But there is also a really sincere attempt to actually express my own experience in language that makes sense to me.
Well, there's a nice question here. It's the only one we've had so far. And you might want to keep what you've just said about discovering late 20th century sort of, you know, nouveau roman and other things in mind when you answer this, as well as, you know, the question itself. So an anonymous attendee, appropriately perhaps, says the subtitle suggests that the book is useful because the subtitle is a user manual. So who is the user and what is used? How should we use it?
Okay, well, I can take you to the end of the book and I can give away the plot. There's a bit where I say a user is what is used. So I'm very interested in, as we've been talking about, this idea of self-exploitation throughout. So the first part of the book, I'm talking about offline exploitation as a woman, mainly through domestic and non-professional care work. And then online, this zone which seems to offer escape from that sort of persona, but is also a zone of exploitation in different sorts of ways, but in which there's a kind of a hint of agency involved in this kind of self-staging. So really, I think it's, I guess I also stole the title from Georges Perec. I'm a big Perec fan. So I wanted to think about how can people situate themselves in this online space where, and I certainly haven't solved the problem about offline exploitation, of which, you know, I do detail in the first part of the book, but thinking about how online self-exploitation and offline self-exploitation inform each other a little, and how how, I suppose, right at the end, like I'm talking about the manifesto bit, how and whether the kind of self-exploitation that is available online, where at least there's some control over how you appear and what sort of of work you stage, even if that work is often work that's being done for no more reward than likes, how that can relate to offline usedness and offline using. And I don't think I have an answer for that, but I try and bring those bodies and personas closer together by the end, and keep trying to think about how can, I think by the end I'm kind of going over and over this question of how can we use online spaces to re-describe what is happening offline? How can we bring these kind of rather glamorous online personas together with our probably, or at least for me, certainly less glamorous offline live, in which a lot of physical work is demanded? How can these two things kind of inform and help each other? How can the kind of glamorous online persona retain its opportunity, its staged opportunity for being different or for taking control of your life, and yet how can it admit the presence of all the work that goes into this, the body work, the mind work, the time, the space that is put into creating this, and at the same time maintaining yourself, through social reproduction? I don't have an answer to that. It's a big question. I am going back to it in the next thing to write.
Great. Well, yeah, no, I think that does deserve much further exploration, as you suggested. But that got me thinking a bit as well. You're talking about like the glamorous online persona and the less glamorous offline living, and this process of like editing your own life, I think. And I think about it in relation to my own work, and particularly the memoir that I wrote that grew out of that Guardian series. And particularly my decision to ask you to draw a picture of me for the cover. Verso wanted a photo, and I could not imagine what photo of me, like what one image would adequately convey the contents and how I felt about them. Whereas, having you just give like a little layer of abstraction, or sort of, something slightly less direct form of figuration, on the cover would sort of do something about bridging that idea of this sort of possibly sort of not real or somehow ephemeral online presence and that kind of very unglamorous offline life, because a lot of that book is about the contrast between what you find online and the media and what you make yourself, and then just like the drudgery of day-to-day living. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of mention that really, and just sort of, airing my own kind of thoughts out loud about that being a reason for me asking you to illustrate that cover.
A photo always has context, unless it's like a photo shoot photo, which, with a kind of backdrop and everything. But a photo has, I was thinking of the photo that I used, that I adapted that drawing from, which is a lovely photo, but, it is tied to a particular place and time. And so it always has this kind of background, this context. It's not so transferable. And I think that's one of the aspects of the girl persona online, or indeed anywhere else, but online it's more accessible as a method of self-expression. Obviously, you can't just walk into a model agency and say, "Hey, I want to be a model. Shoot me." But to be able to do that online, there's that sort of, to enter into the zone of context-free appearance, when the act of appearing, and I don't necessarily mean appearance as in what you look like, but the act of appearing itself is a kind of magical thing, and is kind of, it's that kind of context stripping, which, as I said, and as you wrote about as well, it's both useful and it does something, but it also refuses to admit something, or at least what we've both been trying to do, I think, in our work is to kind of place both side by side and allow them to exist together and to kind of rub together a little bit and produce something, I hope.
Yeah, there's another question here from Leo, so I'm going to ask that, who says, "Hi, Joanna, can you tell us about the thought experiments you asked the readers to do throughout the book?"
Okay, yeah. I mean, I started reading a lot about artificial intelligence and experiment. I was mentioning the Turing one before, because there's a lot of work particularly in cyberfeminism and about what is the difference between a woman and a machine? If women have been often treated as something parahuman, not with full human rights, then and often have been expected to work in mechanical ways, and also, you know, there's a whole kind of fantasy from Pygmalion onwards, and I'm talking about the Greek myth, not the kind of Broadway musical, but although that too, of the idea of women who can be changed, manipulated, and who are artificial. In the original Pygmalion story, the Pygmalion brings a statue of the ideal woman to life. So the thought experiments were really coming from experiments about identity. There are a few other ones I use. There's lots of experiments about language and identity as well. For instance, there's the Turing's own experiment, the Turing test, which at first was heavily gendered, and subsequent iterations haven't been. But in the first iteration of the Turing test, there was supposed to be a man, a woman, and a computer, all sending messages to a human recipient of any sex or gender. And the task of the man, the woman, and the computer was to convince the receptive human through words that they were a woman. So this kind of contention around what a woman is was very interesting to me. That made me think of some more thought experiments around text, for instance, and identity, and communal identity as well, and individual identity. Like there's the Chinese room problem, which I think was mainly worked on by John Searle in the 80s, in which he asked if a person, in his case, you know, he specifies a man. He says for some reason, for example, a man is locked into a room and given a series of instructions in Chinese, which is a language he doesn't speak, and is given certain ways of decoding certain characters, but doesn't know the whole language. Can they be said to be having a conversation? And this is a thought experiment again about AI. Can AI be considered intelligent because it's speaking back to you? And then the Chinese nation, for some reason, Western philosophers like to think about things as Chinese. That's probably got a lot of problematic history around it. But the Chinese nation problem, which I mentioned in the first thought experiment, about, you know, if the entire Chinese nation is invited to flip a switch either up or down, and one of those switches indicates pain. Philosophers also like thought experiments about pain. I don't know what that's about. Then if most of them flip the switch towards the pain side, can pain be said to be experienced? And if so, by whom? And I think about that a lot in context of things like Me Too, in which if pain is confessed to, and also the confessional essays in general, if you confess to pain, it's a little bit like the prisoner's dilemma problem. If you confess, but the other person doesn't, then you're just out there on your own. But if a lot of people confess to having a problem, then they can work together and try to get things changed.
Well, thanks so much, Joanna. So yeah, Girl Online, available from Verso Books and all good bookshops, maybe some bad bookshops, or some like mediocre ones. But yeah, you know, buy it, read Joanna's other work as well. Read Hout Bahnhof, it's beautiful. Yeah, thank you all for coming. And Joanna, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been really nice.
Cool. All right, everyone, thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye for now.